Welcome to an update on the recent proposed NAR settlement provided by Idaho Realtors. I'm David Hensley, the CEO of Idaho Realtors, and we hope that this video dispels some of the myths and misinformation on the proposed settlement, helps clear up some confusion, and provides you with some insight into the terms of the settlement and how it may impact you, our members, or the public. Before we get started, there are three things I want to go over, and I hope you keep these in mind as we move through the presentation. The first is that this is a proposed settlement. Before it becomes final, the court is going to have to approve that. There's a process in place for parties to object to that, and we should see, hopefully, final approval sometime in early 2025. But before then, please remember, it is simply a proposed settlement. Second caveat is that the opinions you hear today are my own, and they should not be attributed to the Idaho Realtors or the executive committee of the Idaho Realtors. And third, and finally, I'm a recovering lawyer. Nothing herein should be considered legal advice, and if you need legal advice, please reach out to your lawyer. So with those things in mind, let's get started. If you've been paying attention to the media and the headlines, a lot of it seems doom and gloom, not only about the future of the industry, but about our members. One of my favorite headlines comes from Fortune, where they predict that realtors are going to go the way of the travel agent. That is, they're going to go extinct. We hope today, after watching this presentation, that you gain a new perspective, and one that I hope represents something similar to what I experience every day, traveling from the office to my home. And that new perspective is, prior to the settlement, maybe it was a little faster. Maybe the route was a little easier. Maybe it took me less time to get between those 2 points. But I submit to you that after the settlement, nothing in terms of the destination has changed. It may take me a little longer, may take me a little further, but again, the destination and what you do and your importance as a realtor to the transaction and to the people you serve have not changed. So keep that perspective in mind as we continue to work through the proposed settlement and its components. Let's give you some more perspective. Why do I think NAR settled? Well, I want to thank Rick Harris for this slide because it's an important snapshot of the legal landscape as of the settlement itself. For many of us, we were surprised when we heard that NAR had settled the case. The conversation prior to that was that NAR was evaluating and looking at appealing the court and the jury verdict against them. But as you can see from this slide, the legal landscape was truly daunting, and NAR faced numerous copycat lawsuits across the country, filed in many courts, demonstrated here by the number in each state of the cases that were filed. 20 of those were brought by plaintiffs who were sellers, 4 from plaintiffs who were buyers, and 3 of those were against broker-owned MLSs. The legal landscape was an extreme challenge to NAR, including the jury verdict against them in Sitzer and Burnett for $1.78 billion. And of course, all of that was going on against the backdrop of the DOJ and the litigation with the federal government, where they had recently pulled out of a settlement with NAR. So keeping the legal landscape in mind, here are a few other reasons why I think NAR chose to settle. Other defendants in the case began to settle. We saw reports of that. Inman had reported that after RE/MAX had settled for $55 million, Anywhere had settled for $83.5 million as well. Keller Williams also settled for $70 million. So as the defendants began to settle out of the case, there was mounting pressure on NAR to seek a resolution.
NAR has long maintained that settlement does not equal an admission of any wrongdoing. They continue to maintain they did nothing wrong and will continue to maintain they did nothing wrong. But they saw a path forward through settlement to end the litigation nationally and achieve a settlement nationwide that would relinquish all of the claims that sellers had been bringing through the initial case and through all of the copycat cases. So there was an opportunity for them to resolve the seller complaints once and for all, and they wanted to take advantage of that nationally.
NAR should be applauded because they saw this as an opportunity to settle not only this case, but all of the seller claims nationally, providing certainty and conclusion for its members, brokers, and MLSs. And finally, one of the reasons why they may have settled can be seen in the lone defendant who remains, Home Services of America. Real Estate News recently reported that they're staring down the barrel of a $4.7 billion claim from the plaintiffs in that case because they decided to stay and litigate. Those are just some of the reasons why NAR may have decided to settle. In addition to that, NAR has reported that the cost of appealing that through a bond with the court probably exceeded the resources that they had. They also looked at bankruptcy and realized that that was not going to provide any certainty for the members or a fitting conclusion to this so that the industry could move forward. All of that in just a context of why NAR may have decided to settle and bring this case to hopefully a resolution when it's approved by the court. So let's get into the proposed settlement agreement itself. Here it is, 108 pages. Later on in this presentation, we have a QR code that will take you directly to the presentation itself and a copy of the settlement. But before we get into the components of the proposed settlement, let's talk about the timelines. A lot of the timelines and requirements are triggered after the plaintiffs filed their preliminary motion for approval with the court. NAR anticipates, as you see from this slide, that that should take place early in April and maybe perhaps by the middle of April. Once that does, that's going to kick off a deadline 50 days later for MLSs owned by associations and non-member MLSs and certain brokerages to file paperwork with the court, letting them know that they're going to comply and be part of the settlement. NAR is hopeful that by the end of this year, 2024, or early next, 2025, they will have final approval from the court, and that means that the settlement will be effective. So let's talk about who's covered in the settlement. If you're a member, you are covered, unless you fall into two specific categories. If you're an employee of any of the brokerages or businesses on this slide, or you're part of Home Services of America, who still remains as the lone defendant in the case. Other than that, as a member, you're covered by the settlement. We'll get into what that means in a few slides. So who else is covered? Well, NAR, of course, state and local associations, MLSs that are owned exclusively or operated by a member association that agreed to comply with the practice changes that we'll get into in a minute, and brokerages that had less than $2 billion in total transaction value for home sales in 2022, who have a realtor as their principal and agree to comply with the terms of the settlement, are covered under the settlement automatically. Now, there are a few entities that are not automatically covered, so let's discuss those. Of course, the first, Home Services of America, and we've discussed that. Second, non-realtor MLSs. There is a mechanism for those types of MLSs to be included within the provisions of the settlement. In Idaho, all of our MLSs are realtor-owned and operated. So we don't have any of those types of MLSs in the state. Some brokerages are not automatically covered under the settlement. Those are going to be brokerages that had an excess of $2 billion in total transaction value for home sales in 2022. Inman reported that there are 93 brokerages nationally that fall into this category and would not automatically be covered by the settlement. In Idaho, so far, we know of one, and we've been reaching out to that brokerage and discussing what it looks like for them moving forward as well. So with that, let's get into the components of the settlement itself. Well, I think the settlement can really be broken down into two specific areas. The first is the release provided by the plaintiffs, and the second are the responsibilities that the defendants and those parties who are covered by the settlement agreed to adhere to moving forward. Of the responsibilities, there's really two categories: financial and industry changes. So let's talk about the release itself. The plaintiffs and NAR first agreed that the settlement is going to have national implications. That is, it's going to resolve all of the claims by sellers nationally, not only in the Sitzer-Burnett case, but all of the copycat cases. Now, I want to pause here and make sure that I'm clear. We're just talking about the seller cases. The buyer litigation is still out there and is not a subject to this proposed settlement. But what does it mean to be released? It means that the plaintiffs are not going to sue any of the covered parties for any of the claims that were brought, specifically surrounding the compensation and the policies of the National Association of Realtors or those brokerages as we move forward. It means that you are absolved from any potential liability moving forward as long as you adhere to the provisions of the settlement. So with that, let's talk about the responsibilities, specifically the financial responsibilities. NAR has agreed to pay $418 million into a settlement fund for the plaintiffs. I want to pause and remind you that the jury verdict against NAR and the other brokerages totaled $5.6 billion, and NAR was going to owe a portion of that, still to be determined. But now, with this settlement, that's off the table. So when NAR pays the $418 million, their financial obligation to the plaintiffs will be met. And that financial obligation is going to be broken down into a series of payments. The first payment is going to come 30 days after that motion for preliminary approval filed by the plaintiffs, and that will be $5 million. 90 days after final approval by the court, likely sometime in 2025, NAR is going to have to pay $197 million into the settlement fund. A year after that, they're going to owe $72 million into the fund. And a year after the $72 million first payment, they will owe a second payment of $72 million. 3 years after that, they will owe a final payment, the balance and interest that remains. And I've received a lot of questions from people, well, who's going to get that money? Well, the settlement fund's going to be there for the plaintiffs, those people who sold homes within the specific timeframes, who become part of the class and stay part of the class, and then also the plaintiff's attorneys. Outside of those financial responsibilities, other funds will be deposited by brokerages that fall outside the automatic inclusion and MLSs that are not owned by members. All of those monies will then be available for the class once the court determines that towards the end of the litigation. Let's talk about the other responsibilities, specifically the industry changes that NAR has agreed to. First and foremost, NAR has agreed to eliminate and prohibit any requirement that listing brokers must make offers of compensation. But the good news is offers of compensation can continue to be offered, and they're negotiable. We'll get into that in a minute. NAR has agreed to prohibit any offer of compensation through the MLS. Broadly speaking, the MLSs are not going to be the place where members go to find what compensation may be part of a listing. Instead, we're going to have to seek other avenues, which we have and have been traditionally used to communicate and negotiate those offers of compensation. Additionally, NAR agreed to require MLSs to eliminate compensation fields and prohibit the sharing of offers of compensation through the MLS. Again, it's not prohibited to provide compensation, and it's not prohibited to offer compensation. It's just not allowed through the MLSs. NAR also agreed to eliminate and prohibit any requirements conditioning participation in an MLS on first offering or accepting compensation to buyer representatives or brokers. A big change, NAR agreed that written agreements will be signed by buyers before they tour a home. And the components of those written agreements are going to revolve around the compensation that a buyer's agent is anticipating as part of the transaction. Moreover, NAR agreed to prohibit realtors from representing or claiming their services are free or available at no cost unless they truly are, unless you intend on receiving no financial contribution from any source for the services you provide. Absent that, you're prohibited from making that representation. Another big change, require seller agents to disclose and obtain their approval from the seller to offer compensation or pay compensation to a buyer agent or broker before that offer or compensation is made. NAR also agreed to require realtors to disclose that commissions are negotiable and not set by law. Finally, NAR agreed to prohibit realtors from steering based on compensation surrounding a property or listing, and rescind and modify any of their existing rules inconsistent with the proposed practice changes. Now, you may be asking yourself, when can we anticipate these proposed changes going into effect? Right now, the time frame, NAR is hoping to have these about mid-July, and they're working with local associations, state associations, and MLSs on a rollout of what that will look like. So how will the settlement impact associations, members, brokers? Let's get into that. First, Idaho Realtors. The settlement's going to require that all of our forms comply with the requirements of the settlement agreement. Second, we're going to have to provide education on the changes not only associated with the settlement itself, but the practice changes that are proposed under the settlement. Independent of the settlement, we have undertaken a review of our forms to determine any gaps between what the settlement requires and our current language. We're working with our forms committee and the executive committee on proposals to make sure that those forms remain a valuable tool for you as you move forward and navigate the settlement itself. Before the middle of April, we hope to convene that forms committee so that we give them plenty of time to look at the issues and come up with solutions that are going to help all of our members and ensure the forms are great and what you need. What does it mean for buyer's agents? Well, again, beginning in mid-July 2024, we anticipate that you will be prohibited from representing free or no-cost services, again, unless you will not receive compensation for the services you provide in that transaction. We also know that you're going to have a signed agreement with the buyer before they tour a home. Idaho Realtors is looking at our RE15, the buyer compensation agreement, and our RE14, the buyer representation agreement. We're looking at both forms to see if the language is sufficient under the terms of the settlement to help you navigate the requirements of the settlement. But we also understand how tough that conversation is to have prior to touring a home. So we're reaching out to members to get information, to gather opinions on the best way to address that. That may be a new form. That may be something in conjunction with the blue brochure that you provide to potential customers and clients. Idaho Realtors is looking at that, but we're also looking at adding language to our RE15 and RE14 that helps ensure your compliance with the settlement, specifically that commissions are negotiable and not set by law. And then finally, you will be prohibited from steering based on offers of compensation surrounding listings and properties. Those are the changes for the buyers under the proposed settlement agreement. Let's talk about what it's going to mean for sellers. Again, same prohibition. You can't represent free or no-cost services unless that's your intention, unless you're not going to receive compensation. You're going to be required to have in writing pre-approval from your sellers before you can make an offer or payment of compensation. And it's going to have to specify the amount or rate that would be paid to the buyer, agent, or broker. And again, that's going to have to be provided in advance of any offer or payment. And the good news is Idaho Realtors Form RE16 already goes a long way towards accomplishing the requirements of the settlement. And it's going to be a valuable tool for sellers, seller brokers, and listing agents as we move forward. Finally, listing agents are going to be required to disclose that commissions are negotiable and not set by law. And again, Idaho Realtors is going to cover that through changes to the RE12 and possibly the RE16. Let's talk about how the settlement's going to possibly impact compensation. Here's what we know so far. If the settlement becomes final, compensation is going to be negotiated per transaction, like it is today. It's not going to be offered or discussed in the MLS. It's not going to be financed because it's not an interested party contribution, and Fannie, Freddie, and the VA still prohibit that. You're going to have a written agreement with the buyer before you tour a home, and that agreement's going to have to talk about compensation. It's going to have to notify them the types of compensation, how that occurs, what you get paid. Sellers, seller agents, listing agents, and brokers, you're going to have pre-approval from your sellers in writing before you can make an offer of compensation to a buyer broker or pay that to the buyer broker or buyer agent. But compensation is still allowed. It's negotiable, and it's still going to be provided for buyer agents and buyer brokers. The types of compensation aren't going to change. Fixed fee commission, a portion of the listing broker's compensation, all of the traditional means by which buyers' representatives have been paid are going to continue. So I hope this video provided you with a different perspective, an opposite of the doom and gloom you've heard through the media, some of the misinformation in the headlines. And hopefully you understand that today, these changes, although proposed, are not changing the destination or your value as a realtor. May add a little time, may make the route a little longer, but in the end, you're still getting to where you were yesterday, today, and tomorrow. This QR code will take you directly to a copy of the settlement agreement itself. We hope that you'll scan that. If you want more information or resources, please visit facts.realtor or competition.realtor. Those sites are maintained by NAR and updated regularly. Additionally, if you'd like more information or have questions, you can contact me via email or go to idahorealtors.com for our website, where we have a page devoted specifically to the settlement, what it means, and its impacts. This QR code will take you directly there. I hope you found this information helpful, insightful, and I hope it cleared up some of the confusion and misinformation that's out there. Thank you.